Okay, so we're here to learn how to import motion capture, stabilize it, and work on editing a little bit. Now, some of the data we get with the Kinect capture, which we went over last week, doesn't come in so well. So what I'm going to do is import a really badly captured Kinect motion capture file. So I'm going to go ahead and click on import here. And let's just find where I put it. We are, and we're going to import it as an FBX file. And you can see here, I'm going to select, I think it was even a 1, that was the one that I wanted to use. And let's look and see what happens. Okay, once we've imported it, most of this tends to import all in a ball at the world 00. That's just how it imports. So a lot of people get a little freaked out by this, but you don't really need to worry because now I'm going to change my time length. I already know the length of this animation. Once you actually play the animation, you'll see that you'll get animation data. And it'll show up kind of way off the grid here. This is just how the Kinect captures data. And a lot of motion capture studios as well don't really give you perfect data right here on the grid as you'd like it. Most of the time, the root node is in the center and it's always skewed and kind of offset like this. But we're going to figure out how to offset and stabilize this data here. So I'm just going to play through the animation. And it's not so terrible if the feet weren't completely messed up. And when I captured this on myself, I was wearing black shoes, and the Kinect has a real problem with shiny black shoes, probably because it reflects the light or the infrared signal. So as you can see, the feet here are a total mess. Now, normally we would redo this completely, but one of the things that I want to teach you here today is how to stabilize this data and actually come up with a solution that gives you stable data with the bottom part while you can then use the top part. Because generally speaking, with the Kinect capture, we get a lot better data on the arms than we do with the legs. So this will work with any unstable leg positions, which are pretty much the majority of those Kinect Kinect motion capture solutions are generally very unstable with the feet. So how do we lock down the feet? Well, I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, our first goal, however, is simply to offset this footage, because we don't really want to be looking at this way off the grid. We kind of want to see it on the grid and move it over here. We can't really take this guy and just say move him over here, right? Why? Because we've got a ton of keyframe data down here, and it's not. We could move him over for one frame, but all that data down here is going to keep him all the way on the other side of the grid from the animation data. So we're going to open up my graph editor here. Our first step, offset our data. So we get it in a readable spot somewhere in the center of the grid. Right? So the way to do this, and it's a little bit easier, we have to really be careful with the rotations. But when we deal with the translations, it's pretty much a one-to-one deal here. All right, I want to move him forward in that z-axis. So I'm going to click on the translate z. See how I'm selecting the curve. So here's all the data. And if you notice, you have all these tangents here. We don't really want to see the tangents. Why? Because it'll crash. Even a moderately powerful computer will really crash when it tries to view all this. It seems to want to crash your GPU of the graphics card. So what I do is I go to View, Tangents, and click on Never. And then we don't have to see the tangents and we don't get that problem. Okay, so I'm zooming out here, and what I'm going to do is just select the entire curve here. Right, and now I'm going to go to my Move Keys tool, which happens to be my Move tool. So I click on W to make sure I'm in the Move tool, and you can see that it's a Move tool because it has a little square above the cursor there that you can see. So now that I'm in my Move tool, I'm going to hold the Shift key down. Now that ensures that it's going to constrain it to a single axis, either the X or the Y, because this is a 2D movement. Now I'm going to click on the middle mouse button, right, and see that question mark? It's asking me, do I want to go vertical or do I want to go horizontal? And it's basically going to get my mouse axis from me. So I'm going to go and see I've accidentally, sometimes it's a really touchy, sensitive action, so I'm going to undo that because I definitely do not want to move this in time. We don't want to move it horizontal. We only want to move it in the vertical, which is value. So there we go. I'm moving up here. I actually want to be moving it down. So I'm continuing to hold down that Shift key, and if I zoom out, the scale of my movement will get bigger. Now, as you can see, we've completely changed the entirety of that axis of translation, which means we've offset the entire animation by whatever we moved this curve down by. So we didn't lose any data, we didn't change the timing, all we did was offset where this action occurs on the hip here, on the translate of the hip. Alright, so let's just do the same. Oops. And once again, my mistake in moving it in the horizontal. We want it to move in the vertical here, up and down. That changes the value globally. We're not scaling, we're just translating the value. Okay, now the same thing has to happen. Once again, the connect really tends to get you at a skewed angle. See how it's captured me at this kind of 30 degree, 25 degree angle here. We want to offset that. Now once again, we have to be very, very careful when we're dealing with these rotates, right? Because the rotate of an Euler channel is dependent on the other ones, depending on where it is in the rotate order. Without getting too deep in the rotate order, changing the values on one of these channels and not keeping them all congruent can really mess things up. So you absolutely must not shift this left and right, because it will really screw things up. There's a rotation order that will completely strip your animation if you happen to accidentally move it left and right. Right, we want to move it up and down. Right, we're changing the value, but the timing is the same. So I'm just gonna tweak it a little bit there. And as I see it now, it looks pretty in line. I assume that I'm standing in a straight line. I'm getting it pretty decently, so I'm going to leave it there. And actually now I'm going to, and some people like to have this in the center of the world, the axis, the 0, 0. I kind of like to have his feet. We want a spot where we could, if we wanted to, later on down the road, say let's lock his feet down to the ground plane. So I'm going to offset his value in the Y, just like I did with everything else. And if I zoom in, I'll get a little more precise control over it, as you can see. And it's not going to be perfect, especially because we have those feet jumping around everywhere. The one thing I do know is when I had my legs wide, in a wide stance, they were pretty much touching the ground. So maybe we can use that as our axis, or use that as our template, or just reference point, kind of move them up a little bit. So, and obviously, as we see, he starts out way above the grid plane. We can fix some of these things later. Now what I think I'm going to do is make the decision that I want him to be standing with his feet somewhat on the ground. We can kind of make some assumptions that that's the length of the biped leg. And once again, this is really horrible data, and you really wouldn't want to work with this kind of data. But if you can stabilize this and get some reading off it, and a lot of times, if you only really need that upper body animation, and you can stabilize and get rid of that lower body, which is what we're going to do here, it really works to your advantage because you don't have to go back and retake it. Because to get stable leg data, it seems like there's going to be a lot of work to do that. Okay, so now we can play our animation. And we can see, here's the beginning of the animation, right? Kind of pre-roll, and then as we get to about frame 30, and this is really where the animation should start, so we should get rid of all the keyframes here. Alright, so for frame 30, the hand goes behind the back to pull the arrow out, right? And you can see the wrist actually, it got some decent motion on the wrist here, and the wrist actually turns, rocks the arrow, pulls it back, and then the arrow would be released right about there. And we're getting some animation on the hands that it picked up from the connect. And then back to a regular stance. And then we have a bunch of extraneous data here that we don't really need. Okay, so let's get rid of the data that we don't need. Just kind of dump stuff we don't need. And one of the big things about doing all of this stabilizing is just dumping stuff that's unnecessary. We've got all this extra data, aren't going to need it. Let's get rid of it now instead of messing around with it later when we want to move it to the control rig and back. Alright, so I've got my hips selected here. I'm going to type in select minus HI. And that's going to select everything under that hierarchy, but I must also hit Control Shift and reselect the hips, or it won't do this all at the same time. And you can see all this data in here, and it's going to be ridiculously dense here. We don't really want to scale out. Sometimes in zooming out here, it'll crash the entire computer. What we do want to do is say Edit, Delete, and we're going to choose a start and end. We're going to delete from frame 0 to frame 30. And this will get rid of all the keyframes for everything we have selected which is the entire skeleton, from 0 to 30. Let's go ahead and hit apply. Okay, so we get this big chunk here. Now let's say, where does this end? All right, release the arrow back to a stance, and let's say 120. 120 is our endpoint for this action. And we're going to once again go to Edit and Delete from 121 to, and we can just say whatever the end point here is, which is 148, and it'll just get rid of all that extra stuff. Now, if we really want to be neat about it, we can go to our dope sheet here, and I'm just going to zoom out. The dope sheet is very buggy in its display. I'm just going to select all these, and we can just move these back to 0, and I'm kind of zooming in here so I can, it snaps these, so I can just back. And actually, I kind of want to put it on frame 1, not 0. We're going to reserve 0 for our T stance. Okay, so let's deselect everything because it's clogging up our viewport down here. And let's go to that graph editor. Okay, so now we've got the action. Boom. So here's our initial, right? So our classic animation. I'm going to type in 0 here. We can open that 0 frame up. So our classic animation poses, right? Here is our rest. Here is our exaggeration, or here's our anticipation, excuse me. Here's the action, boom, and follow through. So we've got kind of a strong action here with the exception of these feet being all over the place, which we are going to fix. All right, so now what I want to do is figure out what data here that I don't want, right? Now, in order to figure out some of these things, when we know we're going to create this human IK character, we know we're going to need to put him in the T stance. So let's get him properly in the T stance first so we can define him as a character. Before we actually define him, we're going to dump some data and things like that. But let's find out where all his dimensions are, because the biggest problem I have is I have these feet jumping all around here. And remember, we don't really want translation data from anything other than the root node, unless we have a really specific. I'm just going to hit F. Of course, my keyboard shortcuts don't want to work here. I'm just going to save this out. This is kind of a bug in Maya. And I'm just going to save this out. I have to restart Maya. The reason being there's some kind of screen bug here that basically completely short circuits my keyboard shortcuts. It's really annoying. So once you restart, your keyboard shortcuts will work again. I think it's some kind of display thing. So, while we're waiting for this to load, there it goes. Alright, so I'll just open up my recent files here. There we go. Alright, so now bring this up. And what I was saying is that you don't really want translation data in a joint. Why would you want a joint to translate, right? The only joint you really want to translate is the hip node. Now, when you get this animation data from motion capture, oftentimes you will get translation data. You can look down here and you get to see how all these bizarre translation pieces here. And what this is basically just a wiggle. That hip is moving around. We don't really want that stuff happening. The only place you might want some translation data is in the shoulder here, and because you can derive the movement of the clavicle, the rotation of the clavicle, from the translation, especially the translation Y, and you can see that the translate Y is working. There's a lot more data in the translate Y about humerus, because then you can determine where the clavicle is rotating. Now, in this case, we're not going to worry too much about that. We can always do that later, and we can always derive the data from the clavicle here doesn't really have any translation data, and this is just how the Rectal Connect animation happens. And it's trying to give you clavicle data, but really the thing is it doesn't really know. I mean, some of these values are pretty small. in their change. So here's our negative 129. This is really a very tight curve. You're not getting a whole lot of data that's changing here. Even though it looks like it's going all over the place, you can see it's actually fairly stable, and the reason is because these values are very close to the same. I mean, they're within 4 degrees of rotation. So you're just seeing it just gives it the ability to wiggle a little bit. All right, so what we really don't want is a bunch of translation data that causes a bunch of wiggle and movement. However, we can leave it in there if it's doing us some good, like some of this translation is really not happening a whole lot. Not seeing a lot of difference in those values. I mean, the difference between 24 and 23.371 is not that much. Basically, if there is some translation, it's very small. However, sometimes you can get some really wild, erratic translation data stuff going on, and when that happens, you have to get rid of it. In some things like this here. Very weird kind of transition, and the curve always looks kind of weird, and this is very typical of motion capture data. Alright, so first thing is first, let's go ahead and zero him out. Let's put him in the T-stance. The T-stance is like a reset for our character. And I'm going to hit select minus HI again, and that selects everything in the character with the exception of what I had originally selected. Now we're going to zero out his rotations, and as you will get a skeleton that looks like this. That's perfectly okay. What we're then going to do is make sure that these legs I'm just typing in the value so I get the right one, are rotated downwards, because zeroing everything out if the joint orients aren't offset originally, and the joint orients for these are always going to be 0. We have to create kind of our own joint orients, but basically by rotating it. So I'm rotating these 180 degrees in the Z, because we're putting him in that original, and this always gets fun. Right, here's our left shoulder, and we want the left shoulder to be on his left side. Remember, this is his left shoulder, not left of the screen. And we also want him facing forward in that Z-axis. So if I make this the left shoulder, and you can see the left hand, if we did this, it would look really weird. So now we know which one is which way to rotate this, and I'm changing this to -90. So I'm having to manually put him in that T-stance. I was under the impression that the Breco Connect system did a non-manual created a T-stance for you, but for some reason I didn't get that data here, so I'm just going to do it myself. Really doesn't matter. Change that to 90. Who does that for you? Okay, just by seeing how this is set up, and I know it looks a little weird with the spine here in front of the hips, and that's just how the Breco Connect plugin feeds you the data. It shouldn't matter too much with the human IK system. If you're putting this on another skeleton, you might get some bizarre occurrences here. We may have to actually even offset some of these back and possibly move the legs forward. Translating the legs forward a little bit, and that maybe creates a little bit better, a little bit more stable of a setup for the human IK. I don't think it truly matters because you're just going to get rotation data off of the skeleton onto another model. Now what does matter, that we haven't done quite yet, is to make sure that the lengths of these legs match. And now here's where it becomes very important to pay attention, because without having the lengths of these limbs match, and they do not always match with the Kinect, they just don't. The Kinect does this at some weird angle and it gives you incorrect lengths. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to snap my left leg to my right, and then I'm going to invert that translate x, which makes it negative, which puts it on the other side of the x-axis, right? And that will match the positions of these perfectly. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the knee. I'm snapping it to the other bone with my vertex snap tool, and then I'm actually going to type in 0 here. Now why did I type in 0? Because it's inheriting its transforms from the left up leg, right? And if I typed in, if I created a negative value from this, then it wouldn't match it on the other side. So I just snapped it over there and then zeroed out its position in the X. And what that does is puts it in the exact world space or local space of its parent here. Now I'll see how different the lengths of these are. Well, I'm going to assume right now that we'll make the left leg. I've been matching the left to the right, so let's do that. Once again, then type in 0 here. And now we have the legs in exactly the same spot. Okay, that is one thing human IK must have. These two legs absolutely have got to be in the same spot. They have to be mirrorable. And the other thing that we must do in order to fix this is that these two joints cannot be on the same spot. It doesn't like that. So here's my right shoulder, and I'm just going to tweak this a tad. Move my right shoulder and my left shoulder over slightly, and actually I should make sure that I do this uniformly. Let's once again negate that. You can see what I'm doing is making sure that they're not in the same spot. If they are, the human IK setup will fail. Okay, so now we've got him in his T stance. Before we lose this actual data, we may want to go ahead and define our skeleton. So let's go ahead and, because if you move on the time slider now, you'll lose all of this because we don't have this keyframe. I prefer in this case to not keyframe it, but to set it up with the human IK, and then once you've defined it, you can always go back to this without having a keyframe for it. So let's click on Define Skeleton here. And let's go ahead, and I'm going to do this fairly quickly because we've done this several times. And it's giving me a warning here, which I don't like. Tell me that probably the hips are not facing the axis. So we'll work on that after we get everything done. Now I'm going to hold off on the wrist here, just because we could put in all the wrist and finger joints as part of it, because we got some finger data, but I'm more concerned right now with why it does not like. Alright, now I see what's going on. I think the hips here need to be flipped. There we go. So the hips must be facing the forward axis, and I just hadn't flipped them. What I did is I rotated them 180 degrees in the axis, and now everything is set up, and maybe I'll just make sure, and this is the left hand, or go into the hands here, and it only takes a second to define these, and since we did get some data, it is nice to have all of this defined, because we can see some of that data on any character we put it on. Otherwise, we're not going to get the data to move from one character to another. Alright, there we go. Now it's all defined. It just takes a little bit more time. Okay, so now that he has everything defined, and we got this green light, I'm going to click on Lock. I'm not going to create a control rig yet. Why? Because we've got to get rid of some data. Right? We have him defined. But now there's some stuff we want to get rid of before we put him into any human IK control rig. We have all this data that we don't need and don't want. So let's go back to our stance here. Let's just click on stance. And then we'll go back to none. And this saves our stance. Okay. Because we need to make sure that all of these, and you notice these two are not aligned perfectly. That actually does not matter. I can just do this to be a little attentive about it. But these don't really matter how far they are because they're not really representing anything that important. It's simply because we don't have any data coming onto the ball or the toe. That's the kind of thing you have to do later. Alright, so now let's look at our data here. And we can see that we have rotational and translation data for our heel here. Right? So this represents basically our heel. And we've got all this data here that we don't really want. I mean, look at our translate Y, we have these, and then you can see by looking at the data, we have this crazy information jumping all over the place, right? We don't need any translates for this. And I'm just going to go back to our stance and then none. And this just allows us to make sure that it stays in this position when we get rid of this data. So currently, I don't have any use for any of this data at all. I've got translation and rotation on an ankle that I don't really have any good. None of this data is good. There's no reason to keep it. Actually, that was strange. I should just be able to delete. There we go. Okay, so now we do still get a bunch of jumping, but we'll fix that in a second. Okay, so at least it's not moving around in space anymore. Now we'll just do the same for this, and once again, I'm just resetting this T-pose just so we can go in and select our heel here and just dump all curves. Just get rid of all that data. And that's going to stabilize it a little bit, right? That the translation's not going. Now you obviously see where those knees are popping all over the place and making bizarre motions. Well, we're going to fix that too. All right, so one thing we need to do, and what I'm seeing here in our original spot, now that we've got all the dimensions set up for this guy, we may want to come into the translate Y here, and I'm just going to offset him and just zoom in here to make it a little bit here. And usually because this represents the heel, right? And until we get a character that's got geometry, this is just kind of theoretical, but I just want the heel off the ground. I don't want the heel where the ground plane is. Okay, so what's going on here? Remember, our goal here, we've offset everything, right? So we've gone through the first part, offsetting. Now we're stabilizing. Next, we're going to actually literally edit. So in stabilizing this, one of the things we need to do is get rid of data that we don't need. Fix bad data and get rid of data we don't need. Okay, so one of the things, and let's go stance and then none. One of the things that often trips us up here is that we have a knee here, right? And that knee has data. If we look at our rotate, we have rotate data on all three axes. Now clearly the rotate for the Y and Z is probably going to be less important than the rotate X. Why? Because this is a knee, right? If I'm standing here in a T-pose, how does my knee rotate? Just like that. And no other way. It certainly doesn't translate, right? We don't have any translation, and we really don't get a lot of translate data. Sometimes the Y translate will pop around. We don't need any of this. So we can just select all these and go to edit. And I'm just going to click on delete and make sure I click on all. We'll get rid of all that. Okay, we got our rotation data. And once again, we've got to be kind of careful when we're tweaking this rotation data. Let's look and see where is it popping and moving all over the place. Right, let's click on and rotate Y. And we can really see what's happening if you look at see the data and you see this pop, get this bizarre popping, and it's because you have these big spikes in the data. And yeah, we can go in here and delete these spikes. And because it's Euler rotation, remember this is all dependent. So X, Y, and Z kind of operate together. So now we have to look here and say, okay, well, what's really changing stuff? Now we've got this X data too. We can go through here and do that. Now one thing about Euler channels is we're lucky in this sense because the knee, right? The knee only needs to rotate on one channel, and it is the X. Now it has to be from the stance. Let's go to stance. Back to none here. And what I'm going to do is say the rotate X and Z. In this case, I can separate these channels out because this knee doesn't need to rotate on anything but the X. So now I can do the same for this. And I'm just going to select all the translates and rotate X and Y, and we're going to go to edit and delete. Boom. Now we're only going to get data rotating the knee as it should be rotated. Okay, we still have spikes, right? We still have spot, but now we can narrow it down to one animation channel. And let's check out and see, here it is. Here's our spike, here's our bad data here that we want to avoid. So we can just go in there and delete those. And now look how much more stable this is. And actually, it looks like we got a couple more spikes here in the X. I can kind of go in. This is how we stabilize this. We don't need these. These are extraneous data. It's where it couldn't pick up the data. It's not stable. So we get rid of all the unstable data, and we still have some stuff happening. I can scroll down here, sometimes you miss it. So I'm going to kind of go through here, and I still see there's really no reason to have that. Some of these spikes we can just get rid of, and it creates a smoother change. And once again, here's some area where we could just fix that. Okay, so I think that's about as good as we're going to get in terms of stabilizing our data. So we're getting a stable line of data here in the legs. And then there's a couple places. Now, if you look and see, okay, well, look, that leg is shifting, popping back and forth here. All right, that is not, and it's an experience I'd say, okay, that data, right, where it's shifting back and forth here, that data shift is most likely not coming from here. So here's the only data we have on that is this rotate X, and it's going boom, booms. Where I guarantee that's coming from is we look up here and look, we have this big giant spike here. And I'm going to go to the rotate Y. So you can always look at the joint above it and say, well, where are we getting this really bizarre spike from? And sometimes it's the joint that's above it, and it's probably in all three axes. And here's where it gets tricky. Do you really want to go through every single one of these and figure out where these spikes are? Because sometimes it's really hard to fix them. You can't just delete all that data. Deleting data works in some sense, especially with translations. It doesn't always work for patients. And I did kind of fix that and smooth that out a little bit. There's a better way to do this. Because right now we're using forward kinematics, and it kind of lunges up the system to try to just go in and delete data. All right, so now our goal is now we can really, now that we've gotten rid of all the crap, just garbage that we don't need, and all of the data that we're not using, now we can go in and say, okay, now let's put a solution on top of this that allows us to stabilize it by making IK the translate of an IK effector responsible for controlling the entire leg. Now, human IK gives us a way to do this. It's actually a little easier and more stable to do with an IK handle. We're going to do it in human IK because of the time. I haven't decided which one is best, human IK or IK handles, but it's a little easier to do with IK handle, and you can get rid of a bunch of stuff and stabilize this. And we'll do it with the simple IK handle because I think this is worth investigating. All right, so I'm going to put this guy back into the stance. And what I'm going to do here is, and we can do this with our, as long as we don't create this control rig, these bones are pretty much free to do what we want. All right, so what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go to skeleton, I'm going to create an IK handle. Make sure it's a single chain solver. This is going to be very simple. And what we're doing with this is creating stability. So let's click on our node over here. Now, what happens in Maya when we create an IK node, you'll notice that it will certainly, let's just select this and see we still got this little spike in the data we can maybe get rid of. All right, what happens is we've got data on these joints, right? And it's FK data, forward kinematics data. So Maya is moving this IK effector. Even though you have sticky on, it's not, because we have this leg animated already with forward kinematics, it's not actually keeping this to the spot where it's originally set up. So we have an IK handle. That IK handle is moving with our forward kinematics animation. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to set a keyframe here. And actually, before I do that, one of the things about this IK handle I need to remember is that it doesn't know how this joint is going to rotate. So let's just go to our stance and go back to none. Yeah, I forgot it's not going to give us the stance mode. It's alright. What it's not really. Let's just delete that and it'll go back to, I assume. Yeah, there we go. You have to be a little careful when messing around with this, and this is true of the human IK system. All right, so we're just going to create that IK handle again. Now, what I was doing is I was saying, okay, I can move this IK handle around. The problem is this joint needs a preferred angle. So I'm going to go to my attribute editor, and it's going to rotate on the positive x. We can just test it out here. Actually, it won't work. We'll just type in 90. And that's the reverse way. So let's flip that around to negative 90. All right. Which means if we move this, it will rotate the way it should, right? And every time I'm undoing this, it's creating some really bizarre effects. But as long as there's no keyframe here, it'll just follow the natural animation. So my IK handle is following my forward kinematic skeleton. Now what I want to do is I want my IK handle to separately control this leg. So I'm going to hit S, which sets keyframe. And now you're going to see that we break off. We have an inverse kinematic skeleton, which is this one right here. And it's kind of bizarre that it's doing this. And we have a forward kinematic skeleton. All right, there we go. Now, do you see what's happening? We have two skeletons. Here's the original animation. That's on the forward kinematic skeleton, right? And it's just showing me, I select this, and it's just showing me that's where the data was. But now you've created an IK handle, right? And now the data is being controlled by the IK. And human IK does this exact same thing. And when we go to the next video, we'll be editing the mocap with a human IK setup, doing this exact same thing, but it's a little simpler to understand when we just use the regular Maya stuff. Human IK has a forward kinematic skeleton and an inverse kinematic skeleton. All right, so what we're going to do is, so I got a keyframe here, and let's just zoom out so we can really see the motion. Okay, so here's our motion. We're going to go to our anticipation pose, right? So here's our anticipation. So we're going to anticipate the motion. Right, so here's where we start. I'm just going to go key a frame at 1, and as this starts, I'm just going to leave this here. So I'm going to create keyframes to make sure it stays, the IK handle stays where it is, and it keeps the leg stable. So boom. So the reach. All right. So when the reach is in, so our anticipation's right about there. So I'm actually going to bring this in slightly. Not too much. We'll hit S there. And then, of course, if you're going to make a step, you have to literally step up in the middle. So, actually, let's do that in the middle. So when you make a step inward, and I'm going to, I kind of want that knee to be out a little bit. So I might, there we go. And so we don't get confused, I'll deselect that because when I select it, it shows us the FK. We're not so worried about the FK right now. So now, and don't worry about that left leg, not as important right now. So now what happens is the back step is made because it's part of the anticipation. So back step, right? Now we'll leave it where it is. Let's go ahead and select that. I'm going to hit S, which is just going to keep it at its current state. Now you see where that step forward is? That's coming from that motion capture that I did. So I'm going to follow that, and let's follow it to the point of release, which is really our action. Let's just move it forward, not all the way where it was, but close, right? So we get this boom, slide forward. Now, in the middle of that slide, of course, because it's a human, we pick up that foot. And I'm going to keyframe that again. Boom. And now, let's keyframe it again, because that's the release. And then we'll keyframe it there. And in the middle of that, we just need to lift up that Y, because being a human, you lift your foot up. There we go. Okay, so now I've reanimated this just with a simple IK handle. Now the only part we see where the IK is kind of problematic is this flipping in here. Let's just select that. You see where it's, and this is where the IK is popping a little bit, and that's just because the hip, you can see the hip here. The hip is pulling too far up in the Y. So as it pulls up, that IK won't be able to bend the knee. So I either have to, in this case, drop this value down. You can see it ends up happening when these values are kind of high. So I might want to drop down these values and maybe delete that and just tweak the value a little bit. Now there's more tweaking to be done, but the main thing we've done here is completely and totally stabilize that leg. Now let's do the back leg, and we won't get too fancy with the back leg. All right, so let's go ahead and create an IK handle here. For the back leg. And one thing we also need to make sure we do is set that preferred angle. And actually that's the wrong one. I keep setting it to the 90 and it's negative 90. Okay, now remember the forward kinematics is still going to be controlling this until we set a keyframe there. So let's move to frame 1. I'm just going to set a keyframe. And now the inverse kinematics is completely taking over that. So I've stabilized that leg entirely, so this is what it looked like before. And we can see how the leg is kind of wobbling everywhere. The IK controls it by keeping it exactly where it is, right? Because we've got a keyframe there. So now we've got an animation where we've stabilized the leg by simply creating some IK handles. There we go. And let's just say, where does this end? Frame 88, let's frame 90, and what I'm going to do here is just hit play. And if we look at that original data, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to prefix this hierarchy, and watch this. I'm going to modify when I prefix this hierarchy as edit underscore. Right, so everything will get that hierarchy on it, and let's just import, re-import that last file we had open, which was this one right here. And okay, so here's the original, so we can go ahead and play, and obviously we're going to have to double this so we can actually see the whole thing. But I'm just going to select this and let's check out what it looked like when we first got the data. All right, pretty bad. Legs are jumping all over the place. The upper body was fine, but the lower body was a complete mess. All right, so now here's our animation after stabilizing those legs. Didn't take too long. I mean, we could do some extra stuff on there, but we didn't take too long to stabilize a pair of legs, and we didn't have to use human IK to get to it. Now, we could have used human IK, but this is actually, I think, a little faster and easier and makes a little more sense. When we start using human IK, there are a lot of extra things we can do, which is awesome, but there are also a lot of things that make it a lot more difficult. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this. Now, here's the last step here. Let's go to our character controls, and let's go ahead and bake this to the skeleton. What's happening is we're going to get rid of those IK handles by baking this entire thing to the skeleton. And I'm just going to make sure that we bake to only from 90, frame 90 to 90. So I'm going to say bake to skeleton. And now we get rid of those IK handles. And the data from the IK handles that's stable now on those legs. Pretty awesome. Alright, so we're going to end there. Next video is going to be how to do this same process in human IK and move it back and forth between a control rig.